A roof is not a wall. This is the first thing that most frontier builders failed to understand about heat loss, and it was the mistake that cost them more fuel, more comfort, and more suffering than any other single error in construction. A wall loses heat through conduction. The warm interior air transfers its energy to the interior wall surface. The energy passes through the wall material to the exterior surface, and the cold exterior air carries it away. The rate of heat loss through a wall is determined by the wall's thickness and thermal resistance, and a well-built log wall, 8 to 10 inches of dense wood, provides reasonable resistance to conductive heat loss. But a roof loses heat through a different mechanism, convection, and convection is vastly more efficient at removing heat from a building than conduction. Warm air rises. This is the most basic principle of thermodynamics that applies to buildings, and it means that the warmest air in any heated structure, the air that the stove has worked hardest to produce, accumulates at the highest point of the interior, the ceiling. In a typical frontier cabin with an 8-foot ceiling, the air temperature at floor level might be 50 degrees, while the air temperature at ceiling level is 75 degrees. A 25-degree gradient that puts the hottest air in direct contact with the roof, which is the thinnest, least insulated part of the building envelope. A log wall is 8 inches thick. A typical frontier roof, poles covered with birch bark or boards covered with tar paper with perhaps a layer of sod on top, has an effective insulating thickness of 2 to 3 inches. The roof is 1/3 as thick as the walls. It is in contact with air that is 25 degrees warmer than the air at the walls, and it has a surface area equal to or greater than the floor area of the building. The result is that a typical frontier cabin loses 40 to 60% of its total heat through the roof, more than through all 4 walls combined. The solution was insulation. Effective roof insulation required a material that was lightweight, because the roof structure had to support it in addition to snow load. That trapped air, because still air is the actual insulator in any insulation system. That resisted moisture, because a wet insulator is worse than no insulator, and that was available in quantity at low or no cost on the frontier. Moss worked, but it absorbed moisture and compressed under snow load, losing its insulating air pockets. Straw worked, but it also absorbed moisture and was a fire hazard in direct contact with a stovepipe. Sawdust worked, but it settled and compacted over time, creating gaps in coverage. Wool worked beautifully, but it was far too expensive to use in the quantities needed for roof insulation. Every common frontier insulation material had a critical flaw that limited its effectiveness in the most demanding application: the roof, now. Samira Hadid did not use moss or straw or sawdust or wool. She used reeds, lake reeds, tall, stiff, hollow-stemmed Phragmites that grew in dense stands along the shores of every lake and marsh in the Minnesota lake country, bundled into tight sheaves and packed 12 inches thick between the roof rafters and above the ceiling boards of her cabin. The reeds were free. They were available in unlimited quantity. They were naturally waterproof. They were structurally rigid enough to maintain their loft under snow load without compressing, and they provided an insulating value that no other material available on the frontier could match at any price. The reed tradition was ancient. Samira had grown up in the marshlands of southern Iraq, the Awar, the vast wetlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the Madan people had lived for 5,000 years in houses built entirely of reeds. The Mudhif, the great reed hall of the Madan, was a structure of extraordinary engineering. a vaulted building up to 60 feet long and 20 feet wide, constructed entirely from bundled Phragmites reeds without a single nail, board, or piece of lumber. The reeds were gathered from the marshes, dried, bundled into columns as thick as a man's thigh, bent into arches, and lashed together to form a ribbed vault that was strong enough to resist wind, waterproof enough to shed rain, and insulated well enough to maintain a comfortable interior temperature in both the extreme summer heat, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cool, damp winter of the Iraqi marshlands. The Phragmites reed, the same species that grew in Iraq, in Europe, in Asia, and in the lakes and marshes of Minnesota, had a set of physical properties that made it an almost perfect insulation material. Each reed stem was hollow, a tube approximately half an inch in diameter with walls 1/16 of an inch thick, enclosing a column of trapped air that ran the full length of the stem, typically 6 to 10 feet. A bundle of 100 reed stems contained 100 individual tubes of trapped still air, each sealed from the others by the rigid cell walls of the reed. The trapped air could not circulate, could not convect, could not transfer heat by any mechanism other than conduction through the thin cell walls, and the thin cell walls, being mostly air themselves, plant cell structure is approximately 70% air by volume, were extremely poor conductors. A 12-inch thickness of bundled reeds, packed tightly together, contained thousands of individual air tubes arranged in a honeycomb pattern that provided an insulating value of approximately R30 to R35, equivalent to 10 inches of modern fiberglass bat insulation, and approximately 10 times the insulating value of the same thickness of solid wood. The waterproof property was equally important. The exterior surface of a Phragmite's reed stem is coated with a natural waxy cuticle, a hydrophobic layer that causes water to bead and run off rather than soaking into the plant tissue. This is why reeds survive in water. The stems are waterproof from the outside, even though they grow in standing water. When bundled and used as roofing material, the waxy cuticle caused snowmelt and rainwater to run down the outer surface of the reed bundle and drip off the bottom without penetrating into the interior of the bundle where the insulating air tubes were located. A 12-inch reed bundle could shed water from its outer surface while maintaining dry insulating airspace throughout its interior, a combination that no other natural insulation material could achieve. Moss absorbed water like a sponge. Straw wicked moisture through its stems. Sawdust turned to wet mush. Reeds shed water and stayed dry. Samira had arrived in Minnesota in 1894, part of a small community of Iraqi immigrants who had come to America through the port of New York and traveled west by rail to the lake country of central Minnesota, drawn by letters from earlier arrivals who described a landscape of lakes and marshes that reminded them, improbably, of the Awar. The resemblance was superficial. The Minnesota winters were nothing like the mild, damp winters of southern Iraq, but the presence of water and reeds and open sky was comforting to people who had grown up in a world defined by those elements. Samira's husband had died on the journey. Typhoid fever contracted on the ship, buried at sea 3 days from New York. She arrived in Minnesota alone with her 2 children, Nasir, 14, and Dalal, 11, and a knowledge of reed construction that was about to prove more valuable than any skill possessed by any other settler in the lake country. The cabin Samira built in the fall of 1895 was conventional in its basic structure. Log walls, a plank door, 2 small windows, a cast iron stove, built with hired help and the assistance of neighbors who regarded the Iraqi widow with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. The cabin was adequate for the mild fall weather, but it was not insulated for winter. The roof was the standard frontier construction, rafters covered with a deck of split poles, a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, and 4 inches of sod on top. The total roof insulation was approximately R4, enough to slow heat loss slightly, but nowhere near enough to retain the heat produced by the stove during the Minnesota winter, when temperatures dropped to 20 and 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The first winter, 1895 to 96, was an education. The cabin was cold, not uninhabitably cold, but relentlessly, exhaustingly cold. The kind of cold where the stove had to burn continuously, where the firewood supply dwindled at an alarming rate, where the warmest spot in the cabin was within 3 feet of the stove, and every other location was uncomfortable. The ceiling was the obvious problem. Samira could feel the heat rising, could feel the warm air leaving her face and hands as it rose toward the poorly insulated roof, where it transferred its energy through the thin sod and bark assembly to the frozen air above. She held her hand against the ceiling and felt cold radiating downward from the surface. She held a candle near the ridge and watched the flame bend toward the peak, drawn by the convective current of warm air rushing upward and through. In the spring of 1896, when the ice left the lakes and the reeds began their new growth, pushing up through the dead brown stalks of the previous year's crop, Samira walked to the lakeshore and looked at the vast stands of Phragmites that lined every bay, every inlet, every marshy shoreline for miles. She saw insulation. She saw the mudhif. She saw her mother's house in the marshes, where the reed walls and reed roof kept the interior cool in summer and warm in winter, where the rain ran off the bundled reeds like water off a duck's back, where the structure stood for 20 years on nothing but reed and rope. She began harvesting in July, when the reeds were at their full height, 8 to 10 feet tall, the stems thick and rigid, the leaves still green. She cut them with a long, curved knife, a tool she had brought from Iraq, designed specifically for reed harvesting, working from a small, flat-bottomed boat that she poled through the shallows of the lake. She cut the stems 6 inches above the waterline, gathered them into armfuls, and stacked them on the bank to dry. Nasir helped, working from the shore, bundling the cut reeds into sheaves of approximately 50 stems each, and tying each sheaf with twisted reed leaves. The harvesting took 3 weeks. Samira cut approximately 4,000 reed stems, enough to insulate the entire roof of the cabin to a depth of 12 inches. The reeds dried on the bank through August and September, the green stems turning golden brown as the moisture evaporated, the hollow interiors becoming the sealed air tubes that would provide the insulation. By the 1st of October, the reeds were dry, rigid, and ready. The installation began on October 5th. Samira removed the sod layer from the roof, peeling it off in heavy strips and setting it aside, exposing the birch bark waterproofing layer beneath. She left the birch bark in place. On top of the birch bark, she laid the first course of reed bundles, each bundle approximately 6 inches in diameter and 8 feet long, tied tightly with reed leaf cordage at 12-inch intervals along its length. The bundles were laid perpendicular to the rafters, filling the spaces between the rafters from the eave to the ridge. The first course was 6 inches deep. On top of the first course, she laid a second course. The bundles oriented at right angles to the first, creating a cross-hatched pattern that eliminated any continuous air channel through the insulation layer. The second course brought the total depth to 12 inches. Over the reed bundles, she laid the sod back in place, the same sod she had removed, relaid grass side up, covering the reed insulation with a protective layer of earth and living grass that would shed rain, resist wind, and protect the reeds from physical damage and UV degradation. The total roof assembly, from inside to outside, was ceiling boards, 12 inches of bundled reeds in 2 cross-hatched courses, birch bark waterproofing, and 4 inches of sod. The total insulating value was approximately R34. The R30 of the reed bundles plus the R4 of the sod layer, which was approximately 8 times the insulating value of the original roof without the reeds. The total cost of the reed insulation was $0. The reeds were harvested from public lakeshore at no cost. The cordage was made from dried reed leaves at no cost. The labor was Samira's own and Nasir's, invested over approximately 4 weeks of part-time work. The only tool required was the reed cutting knife that Samira had brought from Iraq. It was, by any measure, the cheapest roof insulation available on the frontier, and it was also the most effective. If you want to know what happened when an Iraqi widow filled her roof with lake reeds while every neighbor said she was building a fire trap, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The first cold night after the reed insulation was installed, October 20th, when the temperature dropped to 12 degrees, announced the difference. Samira banked the stove at 10 in the evening and went to sleep. In previous winters, the cabin temperature would drop from approximately 60 degrees at bedtime to approximately 38 degrees by dawn, a 22-degree crash that left the cabin bitterly cold and required 30 minutes of hard stoking to bring the temperature back up. On this first insulated night, Samira woke at 5 in the morning and the cabin was 51 degrees. The temperature had dropped only 9 degrees in 7 hours, less than half the drop of the previous winter. The stove was still warm, the embers still glowing, and a few sticks of kindling brought the fire back to full burn within 10 minutes. By 6 in the morning, the cabin was 62 degrees and rising. The difference was the ceiling. Samira held her hand against the ceiling boards and felt nothing. No cold radiating downward, no convective current pulling warm air upward. The ceiling was approximately 55 degrees, nearly the same temperature as the room air, because the 12 inches of reed insulation above it were preventing the interior heat from reaching the cold exterior. The heat that the stove produced stayed in the cabin instead of rising through the roof and disappearing into the frozen sky. The stove did not need to work as hard. The firewood lasted longer. The cabin was warmer with less effort. The fuel savings over the first full winter, 1896 to 97, were dramatic. Samira burned approximately 2 1/4 cords of mixed hardwood, compared to approximately 4 cords the previous winter without the reed insulation. The savings of 1 3/4 cords, approximately 3,500 pounds of wood, represented approximately 44% of her previous fuel consumption. At the local price of $5 per cord for cut and split hardwood, the savings were approximately $8.75. Not a fortune, but significant for a widow with 2 children and limited income. More importantly, the reduced fuel consumption meant less time spent cutting, splitting, hauling, and stacking firewood, approximately 4 weeks of labor saved over the course of the winter. Clyde Fenton, whose farm bordered the lakeshore a half-mile east, came to examine the roof in January. Clyde was a practical man, a second-generation Minnesota farmer who had spent 30 winters in the lake country and who understood cold the way a sailor understands water. He climbed onto the roof, brushed away the snow, and examined the sod covering. He pulled back a section of sod and examined the reed bundles beneath. The tightly packed stems, the cross-hatched layering, the dry interior of the bundle despite the frozen sod above it. He pressed his hand into the reed layer and felt the characteristic springy resistance of compressed hollow stems. The reeds gave slightly under pressure, but sprang back when released, maintaining their loft and their air spaces. He noted that the reeds were completely dry, no ice, no frost, no moisture penetration, despite weeks of sub-zero temperatures and 2 feet of snow above. Clyde asked the question that every visitor asked: what about fire? Reeds are flammable. Dried hollow reeds, packed 12 inches thick in a roof directly above a cabin, heated by a wood stove with a stovepipe penetrating the roof. This seemed like an invitation to catastrophe. Samira showed him her fire prevention measures. The stovepipe penetrated the roof through a metal thimble, a double-walled galvanized iron sleeve that maintained a 6-inch clearance between the hot stovepipe and the nearest combustible material on all sides. The reed bundles were cut back 12 inches from the thimble opening, creating a 2-foot diameter zone of clearance around the stovepipe where no reeds were present. The gap was filled with sand, 6 inches of dry sand packed into the cleared zone, providing a non-combustible insulating fill around the stovepipe penetration. The sand was contained by a metal ring, a band of galvanized iron set into the ceiling board opening that prevented it from spilling into the reed layer. The fire prevention worked. In 20 years of operation, from 1896 through 1916, the reed roof insulation never caught fire, never smoldered, never showed any sign of heat damage near the stovepipe penetration. The sand-filled clearance zone maintained a temperature below 150 degrees at its closest point to the stovepipe, well below the ignition temperature of dried reeds, approximately 450 degrees. The precaution was simple, inexpensive, and completely effective. The snow load performance of the reed roof was its most impressive characteristic. The Minnesota Lake Country received heavy snowfall, 60 to 80 inches per winter, with individual storms depositing 12 to 18 inches in a single event. The snow accumulated on the cabin roof throughout the winter, building from a few inches in November to 2 or 3 feet by February. On a conventional frontier roof, this snow load was a structural burden. The weight of 3 feet of snow on a 16 by 18-foot roof was approximately 5,400 pounds, more than 2.5 tons, and poorly built roofs sagged or collapsed under the weight. On Samira's reed-insulated roof, the snow was both a burden and a benefit. The 12-inch reed layer distributed the snow load evenly across the rafters, preventing the point loading that caused conventional roofs to sag at the midpoint between supports. The reeds acted as a structural deck, a continuous mat of interlocked, rigid stems that spread the weight of the snow across the full roof surface rather than concentrating it at the rafters. And the snow itself, sitting on top of the sod layer that sat on top of the reed layer, added its own insulation, R1 per inch of fresh snow, approximately R30 for 3 feet of accumulation. The total roof insulation in February, with the reed layer plus the sod plus the snow, exceeded R60, a value that would not be matched by conventional building insulation technology for another 70 years. The neighbors noticed. Not immediately, the first winter, the reed roof was Samira's private advantage, visible only in her reduced woodpile consumption and her warmer cabin. But by the second winter, when Clyde Fenton had examined the roof and reported his findings to the settlement, other families began asking questions. How much reed did it take? How long did the harvesting take? How were the bundles made? How were they installed? Could they use any reed, or did it have to be the tall Phragmites from the lakeshore? If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. Samira answered every question with patience and precision. She organized reed harvesting expeditions in the summers of 1897 and 1898, leading groups of 3 and 4 families to the lakeshore, demonstrating the cutting technique, the bundling method, and the drying process. She supervised the installation on 4 additional cabins in the fall of 1897, teaching the cross-hatched layering technique and the stovepipe clearance method. By the winter of 1898 to 99, 5 cabins in the settlement had reed-insulated roofs, and the performance data was consistent across all of them. 40 to 50% reduction in fuel consumption, 10 to 15 degree improvement in overnight temperature retention, and 0 moisture penetration through the reed layer. Bess Fenton, Clyde's wife, was the most vocal advocate. She had spent 8 winters in a cabin with a standard sod roof, and the first winter with the reed insulation was, she told everyone who would listen, the first winter she had been warm. Not warm near the stove, warm everywhere in the cabin. Warm at the table, warm on the sleeping platform, warm standing at the kitchen counter with her back to the stove. The heat stayed in the room instead of vanishing through the ceiling, and the room was uniformly comfortable instead of being a furnace within 3 feet of the stove and a refrigerator everywhere else. Bess told Samira that the reeds had given her back her winters, that she had dreaded November for 8 years, and that she now looked forward to the first snowfall, because the snow on the roof meant more insulation and a warmer cabin. The long-term performance exceeded expectations. After 5 winters, Samira inspected the reed layer by removing a section of sod and examining the bundles. The reeds were intact. The stems had not decomposed, had not been damaged by insects, had not absorbed moisture, had not compressed significantly under the snow load. The hollow interiors of the stems were dry and clean. The waxy cuticle on the exterior surfaces was still intact, still shedding water. The cross-hatched layering was still maintaining its full 12-inch loft. The reed insulation showed no degradation from 5 years of thermal cycling between summer heat and winter cold. After 10 winters, the inspection showed minimal change. A few stems on the outer surface of the bundle, the stems in direct contact with the sod layer, had begun to soften as the organic matter in the sod layer leached tannins and moisture onto the contact surface. But the interior of the bundle, the 95% of the reed mass that was not in contact with the sod, was unchanged. The insulating performance, as measured by fuel consumption and overnight temperature retention, had not diminished measurably over the decade. The reeds lasted approximately 15 years before Samira replaced them, not because they had failed, but because the outer layer had degraded enough that she wanted to restore the full R value of the original installation. The replacement was performed in the summer of 1911 using the same technique: harvest, dry, bundle, install in cross-hatched courses, replace sod on top. The total cost was again $0. The total labor was again approximately 4 weeks of part-time work. The new reeds performed identically to the originals. The the science confirmed what practice had demonstrated. Phragmites australis, the common reed, has a thermal conductivity of approximately 0.056 watts per meter Kelvin, which is comparable to modern fiberglass insulation, 0.040 watts per meter Kelvin, and significantly better than wood, 0.12 watts per meter Kelvin. Straw, 0.07 watts per meter Kelvin. Or moss, 0.08 watts per meter Kelvin. The low thermal conductivity results from the hollow stem structure, which creates thousands of sealed air columns per square foot of insulation. The structural rigidity of the stems, each stem has a compressive strength of approximately 50 pounds per square inch, prevents the insulation from compacting under load, maintaining its full loft and air content even under 3 feet of snow. And the waxy cuticle, a natural hydrophobic coating that evolved to protect the reed from the water in which it grows, prevents moisture absorption with an effectiveness comparable to a synthetic vapor barrier. Every lake in Minnesota had reeds. Every cabin in Minnesota needed roof insulation. The connection was obvious once Samira demonstrated it, but it required a woman from the Iraqi marshes, a woman who had grown up in a world built entirely of reeds, to see the building material that surrounded every lake in the territory and that every other settler had regarded as useless swamp grass. The 8 cabins that eventually adopted reed insulation in the settlement, Samira's original plus 7 more installed between 1897 and 1905, saved a combined total of approximately 12 cords of firewood per winter, worth approximately $60 at local prices. Over a decade of operation, the cumulative fuel savings across all 8 cabins exceeded $600, generated by an insulation material that cost nothing, that was available in unlimited quantity, that was waterproof, fire-resistant with proper clearance, structurally sound under heavy snow load, and that lasted 15 years without replacement. The weight comparison between reed thatch and the alternatives deserves detailed analysis, because roof weight determined not only the structural requirements of the building, but also the labor required for maintenance and the risk of catastrophic collapse during heavy snow events. A sod roof on a cabin measuring 18 by 16 feet, approximately 290 square feet of roof surface, weighed approximately 3,500 to 4,000 pounds. This weight was distributed across the rafters, which had to be at least 8 inches in diameter to safely support the load without deflection. Sourcing, cutting, debarking, and lifting 8-inch rafters into position was heavy work that typically required 3 to 4 men and a full day of labor. The weight of the sod roof also created a constant downward force on the walls that compressed the chinking over time, opening gaps and increasing air infiltration. A shake roof on the same cabin weighed approximately 400 pounds, 1/10 of the sod roof, but the shakes provided almost no insulation and leaked within 3 years. The light weight was an advantage for the structure, but a disadvantage for performance. Nasreen's reed thatch on the same cabin weighed approximately 800 pounds, roughly 1/4 of a sod roof, and provided 3 times the insulation of the sod and 18 times the insulation of the shakes, while never leaking. The moderate weight could be supported by standard 6-inch rafters, required no special structural reinforcement, and created minimal compression on the wall chinking. The reed thatch occupied a sweet spot in the weight-to-performance ratio that no other roofing material could match. The snow load calculations reinforced the advantage. Minnesota received an average of 45 to 55 inches of snowfall per winter, with individual storms depositing 6 to 14 inches. On a flat or low-angle roof, this snow accumulated to depths of 2 to 3 feet before the farmer climbed up to shovel it off, a dangerous and time-consuming chore that had to be performed multiple times per winter. The maximum snow load on a flat roof could reach 15 to 20 pounds per square foot, a total weight of approximately 4,500 to 5,800 pounds on a 290 square foot roof. This load, added to the dead weight of a sod roof, could exceed 8,000 pounds, far beyond the capacity of standard rafters and requiring either oversized timbers or frequent shoveling to prevent collapse. On Nasreen's 45-degree reed thatch roof, the maximum snow depth was approximately 6 inches, maintained at that level by continuous shedding, representing a snow load of approximately 3 pounds per square foot, or approximately 870 pounds total. Combined with the 800-pound dead weight of the thatch itself, the total roof load was approximately 1,670 pounds, less than half the dead weight alone of a sod roof, and less than 1/4 of the combined dead weight plus snow load of a sod roof in midwinter. Nasreen never shoveled her roof. She never needed to. The blizzard of February 1899 provided the most extreme test. This was the same storm system that struck across the northern plains and into Alaska, the catastrophic 5-day event that destroyed buildings from the Yukon to the Dakotas. In the Minnesota Lake Country, the storm deposited approximately 28 inches of snow, with temperatures reaching 34 below zero, and sustained winds of 42 miles per hour. During the storm, 2 sod roofs in the settlement collapsed. The first, on Cranmer's barn, failed when the accumulated snow on the low-angle roof exceeded the bearing capacity of the ridgepole, which had been weakened by 3 years of insect damage. The ridgepole cracked at midspan, the roof sagged, and the weight of the sod and snow completed the collapse. Cranmer lost the roof and approximately $20 worth of stored hay and equipment. The second collapse, on a neighbor's cabin, occurred when the wind shifted during the storm, creating a massive drift on the leeward side of the roof that concentrated 12 feet of snow on a 6-foot section of the roof. The concentrated load exceeded the local rafter capacity, and the roof section collapsed inward, dumping approximately a ton of snow and sod into the cabin interior. The family escaped injury because they were on the opposite side of the cabin, but the damage to the building and its contents was extensive. Nasreen's reed thatch handled the storm without stress. The wind stripped the snow from the steep, smooth surface as fast as it accumulated, and the maximum snow depth during the storm, despite 28 inches of total snowfall, never exceeded 8 inches. The rafters showed no deflection. The thatch showed no displacement. The cord ties showed no loosening. The interior was warm, 52 degrees at moderate burn rate in 34 below air, and dry and quiet. After the storm, when the settlement was assessing the damage to its roofs, Nasreen's cabin looked exactly as it had before the storm, except for the drifts of shed snow piled 6 feet deep around the eaves, where the steep roof had deposited its continuous avalanche of sliding snow. The comparison between the collapsed sod roofs and the intact reed thatch was stark and compelling. The sod roofs had failed because they were heavy, flat, and fragile. The weight worked against them rather than for them, and the structural members beneath the sod were vulnerable to insect damage and moisture that reduced their load-bearing capacity over time. The reed thatch succeeded because it was light, steep, and durable. The low weight reduced the structural demand. The steep angle shed the snow load automatically, and the silica-coated reed stems resisted the insect and moisture damage that weakened wooden structural members. The weight comparison between reed thatch and the alternatives deserves detailed analysis, because roof weight determined not only the structural requirements of the building but also the labor required for maintenance and the risk of catastrophic collapse during heavy snow events. A sod roof on a cabin measuring 18 by 16 feet, approximately 290 square feet of roof surface, weighed approximately 3,500 to 4,000 pounds. This weight was distributed across the rafters, which had to be at least 8 inches in diameter to safely support the load without deflection. Sourcing, cutting, debarking, and lifting 8-inch rafters into position was heavy work that typically required 3 to 4 men and a full day of labor. The weight of the sod roof also created a constant downward force on the walls that compressed the chinking over time, opening gaps and increasing air infiltration. A shake roof on the same cabin weighed approximately 400 pounds, 1/10 of the sod roof. But the shakes provided almost no insulation and leaked within 3 years. The light weight was an advantage for the structure, but a disadvantage for performance. Nasreen's reed thatch on the same cabin weighed approximately 800 pounds, roughly 1/4 of a sod roof, and provided 3 times the insulation of the sod and 18 times the insulation of the shakes, while never leaking. The moderate weight could be supported by standard 6-inch rafters, required no special structural reinforcement, and created minimal compression on the wall chinking. The reed thatch occupied a sweet spot in the weight-to-performance ratio that no other roofing material could match. The snow load calculations reinforced the advantage. Minnesota received an average of 45 to 55 inches of snowfall per winter, with individual storms depositing 6 to 14 inches. On a flat or low-angle roof, this snow accumulated to depths of 2 to 3 feet before the farmer climbed up to shovel it off, a dangerous and time-consuming chore that had to be performed multiple times per winter. The maximum snow load on a flat roof could reach 15 to 20 pounds per square foot, a total weight of approximately 4,500 to 5,800 pounds on a 290 square foot roof. This load, added to the dead weight of a sod roof, could exceed 8,000 pounds, far beyond the capacity of standard rafters and requiring either oversized timbers or frequent shoveling to prevent collapse. On Nasreen's 45-degree reed thatch roof, the maximum snow depth was approximately 6 inches, maintained at that level by continuous shedding, representing a snow load of approximately 3 pounds per square foot, or approximately 870 pounds total. Combined with the 800-pound dead weight of the thatch itself, the total roof load was approximately 1,670 pounds, less than half the dead weight alone of a sod roof, and less than 1/4 of the combined dead weight plus snow load of a sod roof in midwinter. Nasreen never shoveled her roof. She never needed to. The blizzard of February 1899 provided the most extreme test. This was the same storm system that struck across the northern plains and into Alaska. The catastrophic multi-day event that destroyed buildings from the Yukon to the Dakotas. In the Minnesota Lake Country, the storm deposited approximately 28 inches of snow with temperatures reaching 34 below zero and sustained winds of 42 miles per hour. During the storm, 2 sod roofs in the settlement collapsed. The first, on Cranmer's barn, failed when the accumulated snow on the low-angle roof exceeded the bearing capacity of the ridgepole, which had been weakened by 3 years of insect damage. The ridgepole cracked at midspan, the roof sagged, and the weight of the sod and snow completed the collapse. Cranmer lost the roof and approximately $20 worth of stored hay and equipment. The second collapse, on a neighbor's cabin, occurred when the wind shifted during the storm, creating a massive drift on the leeward side of the roof that concentrated 12 feet of snow on a 6-foot section. The concentrated load exceeded the local rafter capacity, and the roof section collapsed inward, dumping approximately a ton of snow and sod into the cabin interior. The family escaped injury because they were on the opposite side of the cabin, but the damage was extensive. Nasreen's reed thatch handled the storm without stress. The wind stripped the snow from the steep, smooth surface as fast as it accumulated, and the maximum snow depth during the storm, despite 28 inches of total snowfall, never exceeded 8 inches. The rafters showed no deflection. The thatch showed no displacement. The cord ties showed no loosening. The interior was warm, 52 degrees at moderate burn rate in 34 below air, and dry and quiet. After the storm, when the settlement was assessing damage to its roofs, Nasreen's cabin looked exactly as it had before the storm, except for the drifts of shed snow piled 6 feet deep around the eaves where the steep roof had deposited its continuous avalanche of sliding snow. The comparison between the collapsed sod roofs and the intact reed thatch was stark and compelling. The sod roofs had failed because they were heavy, flat, and fragile. The weight worked against them rather than for them, and the structural members beneath the sod were vulnerable to insect damage and moisture that reduced their load-bearing capacity over time. The reed thatch succeeded because it was light, steep, and durable. The low weight reduced the structural demand. The steep angle shed the snow load automatically, and the silica-coated reed stems resisted the insect and moisture damage that weakened wooden structural members. The bird problem was the only significant nuisance associated with the reed thatch. Sparrows, finches, and wrens found the reed bundles to be ideal nesting material and nesting habitat, and beginning in the first spring after construction, birds attempted to pull individual reeds from the outer layer for nest building, and to excavate cavities in the thatch for nesting sites. The bird activity was not structurally significant. The loss of a few dozen reeds from the outer layer of a 4,000-stem roof was negligible, but it was annoying, and the bird droppings on the thatch surface were unsightly. Nasreen's solution was practical. She attached strips of tin, cut from flattened cans, to the eave line and the ridge line, where they fluttered in the wind and created a glittering visual deterrent that discouraged birds from approaching the roof surface. The tin strips were not entirely effective, but they reduced the bird activity to manageable levels. The durability of the reed thatch in the specific conditions of a Minnesota winter exceeded what the Medan tradition would have predicted based on experience in Iraq. In the warm, humid climate of the Mesopotamian marshes, reed structures typically lasted 5 to 7 years before the reeds deteriorated from moisture, fungal growth, and insect damage. In the cold, dry climate of Minnesota, the same reed species, Phragmites australis, which grew in both locations, lasted 13 years or more because the freezing temperatures killed the fungal organisms that caused rot. The dry winter air prevented the moisture accumulation that promoted decay, and the cold climate insect species were less aggressive in attacking reed tissue than the warm climate species in Iraq. The irony was not lost on Nasreen. A building material that was considered temporary in its country of origin became semi-permanent in its adopted country. The cold that made the Minnesota winter so harsh was the same cold that preserved the reeds, and the system that protected the family from the winter was itself protected by the winter from the biological forces that would have destroyed it in a warmer climate. The blizzard of February 1899 tested every roof in the settlement. The storm arrived on the 9th, a 3-day event that deposited 26 inches of snow with sustained winds of 35 miles per hour and temperatures that dropped to 28 below zero. The wind created drifts that buried fence lines and blocked doors, and the heavy wet snow, unusual for Minnesota, which typically received dry powder, was the densest snow load of the decade. On the cabin roofs, the 26 inches of new snow on top of the existing 18 inches of accumulated pack created a load of approximately 44 inches, nearly 4 feet, weighing approximately 6,800 pounds on a 16 by 18-foot roof. 2 cabins in the settlement suffered roof damage. One, a newer cabin with undersized rafters, developed a visible sag at the ridge pole bending approximately 2 inches under the load, and the owner spent the second day of the blizzard outside in the storm shoveling snow off the roof to prevent collapse, an activity that left him frostbitten on both ears and 3 fingers of his left hand. The other cabin, an older structure with a deteriorated ridgepole, collapsed entirely during the night of the second day, the ridgepole snapping at a point where rot had weakened the wood to approximately 60% of its original strength. The occupants, a man, his wife, and their 2 children, escaped injury only because the sleeping platform was positioned against the wall rather than under the ridgeline, and the collapsing roof fell inward at the center while the wall sections held. They spent the remaining 2 days of the storm in a neighbor's cabin. Samira's reed-insulated roof showed no distress. The 12-inch reed layer, acting as a structural deck, distributed the snow load uniformly across the entire roof surface. The rafters, which Samira had specified at 8-inch diameter, larger than the 6-inch standard, because she understood from the mud-hiff tradition that a roof designed to carry permanent insulation load must be overbuilt, carried the combined weight of the sod, the reeds, and nearly 4 feet of snow without deflection. The ridgepole, a 10-inch spruce log that Samira had selected personally, rejecting 3 candidates before finding one that was straight, sound, and free of rot, carried its share of the load without bending. The thermal performance during the blizzard was extraordinary. The 4 feet of snow on the roof, combined with the 12 inches of reed insulation and the 4 inches of sod, created a total roof insulation value exceeding R70. The ceiling temperature inside the cabin remained at 54 degrees throughout the storm, within 6 degrees of the room air temperature, meaning that virtually no heat was escaping through the roof. The stove burned at its lowest sustainable rate, approximately 12 pounds of wood per day, and the cabin held at 58 to 60 degrees. Samira's total fuel consumption during the 7-day cold period surrounding the storm was approximately 84 pounds, less than a quarter cord, while neighboring cabins without reed insulation burned 200 to 300 pounds in the same period, and still were cold. The sound insulation was an unexpected benefit that every reed-roofed cabin reported. The 12-inch reed layer, with its thousands of small, sealed air chambers, absorbed sound as effectively as it blocked heat. The howling of the wind, which was clearly audible through a conventional sod overbark roof, was muffled to a low, distant hum through the reed insulation. The impact noise of falling branches, hail, and wind-driven debris was absorbed by the reed layer, rather than transmitted through to the ceiling boards. During the February blizzard, when the wind was producing a continuous roar that was psychologically exhausting in the uninsulated cabins, the reed-insulated cabins were quiet. Bess Fenton told Samira that the silence during the storm was almost more valuable than the warmth, that the constant noise of wind through a thin roof was a form of stress that she had endured for years without recognizing it, and that its absence was a relief that she felt in her shoulders and her jaw as the tension of listening to the storm dissolved. The moisture management through spring thaw cycles confirmed the reed's superiority over every other insulation material. When spring arrived and the snow on the roof began to melt, the meltwater percolated down through the sod layer and contacted the outer surface of the reed bundles. On any other insulation material, moss, straw, sawdust, this meltwater would have been absorbed into the insulation, saturating it, destroying its insulating value, and promoting rot and mold growth that would require replacement. On the reed bundles, the meltwater hit the waxy cuticle of the outer reed stems and ran off, channeling downward between the bundled stems to the birch bark waterproofing layer beneath, where it ran to the eaves and dripped off the roof. The interior of the reed bundle remained dry throughout the thaw. Samira verified this by pulling a sample bundle from the roof during the spring of 1897, the first spring after installation, and breaking it open. The interior stems were bone dry. The trapped air columns were clear and unobstructed. The insulation was uncompromised. This moisture resistance had a secondary benefit. It prevented ice damming. Ice dams form when heat escaping through a poorly insulated roof melts the snow on the roof above the heated living space, and the meltwater runs down to the cold eave overhang where it refreezes into a dam of ice that blocks further drainage and forces water back up under the roofing material into the building interior. Ice dams were a chronic problem on frontier cabins with poor roof insulation. The heat loss through the roof was enough to melt the snow above, but the eave was cold enough to refreeze the melt, creating a cycle of melt and dam that damaged roofs and leaked water into cabins throughout the late winter and early spring. The reed insulation virtually eliminated ice damming. The roof surface above the heated living space remained cold because the reed insulation prevented interior heat from reaching the roof surface. And cold roof surfaces do not melt snow. The snow sat on the roof in a stable pack, melting only when the ambient air temperature rose above freezing in the spring, at which point the entire roof melted uniformly rather than selectively above the heated space. The uniform melt produced no differential that could create ice dams. Samira's roof was the only one in the settlement that did not develop ice dams in the late winter thaw cycles, a benefit that protected the birch bark waterproofing layer and extended its service life from the typical 5 to 7 years to approximately 12 years. Samira died in 1918 at the age of 64. Her cabin, with its reed-insulated roof, stood for another 20 years, used by Nasir and his family until the property was sold in the late 1930s. The reed insulation was replaced once during that period, in 1926, 30 years after the original installation, when Nasir harvested fresh reeds and reinstalled the roof using his mother's technique. The replacement reeds served another 12 years with no deterioration. 40 years of reed insulation on a single cabin, 2 installations, $0 in material cost. Approximately 600 cords of firewood saved across the settlement over the full period of operation, and a tradition that traveled 6,000 miles from the marshes of Iraq to the lakes of Minnesota and proved that the best insulation in the world had been growing on the lakeshore all along. The economics of the reed roof over a decade made the case with precision that no neighbor could dispute. Nasreen kept careful records, a habit from her years managing Tariq's household accounts in Basra, and in the spring of 1907, she compiled a 10-year cost comparison between her reed roof and Cranmer's shake roof, the two most comparable buildings in the settlement. Cranmer's shake roof over 10 years, initial construction in 1895, $38 in materials and labor. First re-roofing in 1898, $32, salvage some rafters. Second re-roofing in 1901, $35. Third re-roofing in 1904, $33. Annual leak repair averaging $4 per year, $40 total. Shoveling labor, approximately 12 hours per winter, clearing snow from the low-angle roof at a value of approximately $8 per winter in foregone productive work, $80 total. Emergency repair after the 1899 blizzard, barn roof collapse, $22. Total 10-year cost, $280. Nasreen's reed roof over the same 10 years. Initial construction in 1897, $22. Annual maintenance averaging half a day per year, valued at approximately $3 per winter, $30 total. No re-roofing required in the 10-year period. No leak repair, 0 leaks. No shoveling. The steep angle shed snow automatically. No emergency repairs. No storm damage. Total 10-year cost, $52. The difference was $228 over 10 years, more than the annual income of most families in the settlement. And the reed roof's performance was superior in every measurable dimension. Better insulation, 0 leaks, lower structural stress, automatic snow management, superior sound absorption, longer material life. The only advantage of the shake roof was cultural familiarity. Farmers understood shakes, they had experience with shakes, and they trusted shakes despite the demonstrated inferiority of the material. Cultural inertia was the most powerful force opposing the adoption of reed thatch, more powerful than cost, more powerful than performance, more powerful than the evidence of 13 winters of flawless operation. By 1905, 4 families, in addition to Nasreen and the 2 families she had thatched for in 1900, had adopted reed roofs, and Nasreen had trained Halima and Fawzi to perform the thatching independently. The settlement's 7 reed-roofed structures represented a total investment of approximately $154 and a total of approximately 42 days of construction labor. The comparable cost for shake roofs on the same structures would have been approximately $560 in the first decade alone, with an additional $560 anticipated in the second decade. The reed roofs saved the settlement approximately $400 per decade, a sum that represented meaningful wealth in a community where cash income was measured in hundreds of dollars per year. The maintenance ritual was simple and required no specialized tools. Each spring, after the snowmelt was complete and the roof had dried, Nasreen or Halima climbed the ladder and walked the roof surface, checking each bundle for looseness, displacement, or damage. Loose bundles were retied with fresh cord. Displaced bundles, typically only 1 or 2 per winter, knocked loose by falling branches or ice slides from nearby trees, were repositioned and secured. The bird damage, pulled reeds and small nesting cavities, was repaired by tucking fresh reeds into the disturbed areas and retying the affected bundles. The entire inspection and maintenance process took approximately 4 hours for a standard cabin roof and was performed by one person with a ball of hemp cord, a ladder, and a sickle for trimming any protruding reed ends. Nasreen lived on the lakeshore homestead until her death in 1923 at the age of 71. The reed roof she had built in 1897 had been rethatched twice, once in 1910 and once in 1920, and was in service at the time of her death, 26 years after construction. 3 generations of thatching knowledge, Nasreen to Halima and Fawzi, and from them to their own children, ensured that the tradition continued in the settlement for decades after the original builder was gone. The lake still grew reeds, the reeds still shed snow, the roof still held warmth, and the knowledge that a woman from the marshes of Iraq had brought to the frozen lakes of Minnesota still worked, because the physics of hollow tubes and trapped air and silica coatings and steep angles do not change with geography or time. The vermin resistance of the reed insulation was a practical benefit that Samira had not anticipated. Conventional roof insulation materials, particularly straw and moss, attracted mice, squirrels, and insects that nested in the warm insulating layer above the heated cabin. The rodents chewed tunnels through the insulation, creating channels that reduced the insulating value and admitted drafts. They stored food in the insulation, attracting more rodents and insects. They died in the insulation, creating odors that permeated the ceiling boards and filled the cabin with the smell of decay. Every cabin with straw or moss roof insulation had a rodent problem, and the only solution was periodic removal and replacement of the infested insulation, a labor-intensive process that had to be repeated every 2 to 3 years. The reed insulation resisted rodent infestation for a simple reason. The stems were too hard for mice to chew through efficiently. A dried Phragmites stem has a surface hardness comparable to hardwood. The silica content of the cell walls, approximately 4 to 6% by dry weight, makes the stem abrasive and resistant to gnawing. Mice could chew through a straw stem in seconds. A reed stem took minutes and dulled their teeth. The tightly packed bundles left no existing voids for nesting. A mouse attempting to tunnel through 12 inches of packed reed had to chew through dozens of individual stems, each one hard and silica-rich, to create a passage barely large enough to squeeze through. The effort was not worth the reward when the cabin walls, the foundation logs, and the barn offered easier nesting opportunities. In 10 years of operation, Samira found exactly 2 mouse nests in her reed insulation, both near the eave where the bundle edges were looser and the packing less dense. She compressed the bundles at the eave more tightly after the first discovery and had no further rodent issues. The neighboring cabins with straw insulation found 6 to 12 nests per year and replaced their insulation every 3 years at considerable labor cost. No myths, no miracles, just reeds, cord, a steep angle, and the knowledge that the best roofing material grows in the lake next to your house.